One of the great things Vietnam has, because of its size, is it's a much greater respecter of intellectual property than its big brother overseas. So you can come here and bring your pharmaceutical manufacturing, your computer manufacturing, and not actually suddenly find the factory next door is ripping you off.
Welcome to the New Asia podcast by Muddy Waters Asia. If you like this episode or want to dig deeper into Muddy Waters New World Order Fund, head to muddywatersasia.com or follow us at Muddy Waters Asia for more.
Some have called it Liberation Day. Others, Obliteration Day. Whatever you call it, one thing's for certain. President Trump has ushered in a new world order. The first few weeks have been marked by uncertainty, even chaos. But with chaos often comes great opportunity. And it's in that light that the team from Muddy Waters Asia brings you a new podcast series titled New Asia. Today's segment will be the first in a series providing perspective from the front lines of this new world order. What can you as the audience expect? Well, first we aim to provide an in-depth knowledge of the history and shifting landscape of global trade, economics, and markets. And second, we'll be sharing expert perspectives that are paramount to making proper investment decisions. The world was changing even before President Trump's tariffs, but he has certainly added fuel to the fire. From the perspective of the team at Muddy Waters Asia, Vietnam and India will be the chief beneficiaries of those changes, thanks to positive geographics, demographics, and a receptive investment climate. We'll be looking into all of these issues over the coming episodes. So with that, I'd like to welcome everyone. I am your host, Mike Coolbaugh. Today, I'm joined by our resident expert, Rob Med, the head of Asia for Muddy Waters Asia. He has been in finance in Asia for over 30 years and moved to Vietnam in 2021 to drive their on-the-ground research. Rob, it's great to have you here with us today.
Good morning, Mike. Lovely to speak to you.
So, Rob, I'll be honest. As a macro investor myself, India, Vietnam, even Mexico have been a major focus really ever since President Trump's first trade war. And obviously, that was sort of reinforced throughout the COVID crisis. But with Liberation's Day, 46% tariff on Vietnam, it seems as though it's placed the country firmly on the front lines of this reordering of global supply chains. So I guess the first thing I'd like to open up with here is, can you just provide some context as to where Vietnam sits within global trade and why it's become so relevant in this ongoing trade war?
Vietnam sits in a very interesting place because geographically it's next to China, but it's actually ended up in the middle of a sort of China-US trading relationship. Trump version 1 came out and put some tariffs on China, and so some Chinese factories decided to, should we say, reroute via Vietnam, causing a transshipment problem where everything was designed as being or labeled as coming from Vietnam, whereas in reality it wasn't. Equally, the more honest, as one might put it, Vietnamese exports are when the Koreans, the Japanese, and a few other people said, look, we don't really want to put our intellectual property at risk by having it in China, so we're going to go and manufacture in Vietnam instead. And so Vietnam's seen this sort of double rise, the sort of genuine manufactured in Vietnam rise, and then the transshipment business, low margin, low value added, coming out of China and all going to the US. And what's interesting since particularly 2019 is you've seen imports from the US have stayed pretty much the same level, but exports from Vietnam have just gone through the roof. And it's been a really dramatic change.
Yeah, so, I think most of the general public just assumes that Vietnam serves as sort of this low-cost manufacturing hub for, a lot of U.S. industries, smartphones, clothing, you name it. But, as you just mentioned, there's a lot of other aspects at play here from various countries in Asia. So can you just provide a little bit more background on Vietnam's overall economy?
Well, ironically, Vietnam was the sort of starting point of modern globalization. How did that happen? Well, because during the Vietnam War, the US standardized containerization and shipment so that they could move stuff from the US to Vietnam. Now, of course, it's all about it going the other way, moving it from Vietnam to the US. But Vietnam, you're absolutely right. It came out post the Vietnam War, went through a period of hardcore communism, sort of keeping everyone, the rest of the world at bay. Decided that didn't work, decided to open up and started to encourage foreign direct investment, people moving in, building factories in Vietnam to resurrect the economy. And that's proved really, really successful for Vietnam. Where we are now, though, is, as I say, this sort of mixed period. We've got a super high growth economy thanks to this desire to welcome in foreigners and increase the manufacturing there, which has been great. The problem is this sort of super low margin transshipment business, which is a problem. I don't think, and certainly the impression we've got from the American embassy here and a few other people, the Americans are not that upset about poor countries genuinely manufacturing and building products to send to the US. They understand that. That makes perfect sense. What they don't want is people circumventing rules they put on China. And it's the explosion of that trade that's really caused the problem.
Yeah, so before we move on, you've mentioned this term a couple of times, and I think a lot of people maybe heard it in a different way, more so, reordering or reshoring of global supply chains. But you've mentioned this transshipment. So I know you sort of hit on it a little bit, but could you just explain that a little bit more in detail, just so people understand what you mean by transshipment?
Well, transshipment is very simply getting round what I would describe as the rules of origin. So in other words, you come along and you say, right, we buy all our raw materials in China, we manufacture the product in China, we then put it into a very large cardboard box. We then send it over to Vietnam. In Vietnam, we stick it in a factory. We take out 100 items out of that very big cardboard box, put it into individual cardboard boxes, and then send it on. And we say made in Vietnam. Now, it's clearly not made in Vietnam. My favorite story for this, when I first arrived in Hong Kong in 1996, is that if you believe the World Trade Statistics, Macau was the largest manufacturer of female shoes in the world. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Macau, but there were some casinos, some hotels, and some houses of ill repute, but there certainly wasn't any shoe manufacturing going on. So, clearly that was a nonsense, and eventually that got cracked down. And in the same way, in Vietnam at the moment, there's a lot of stuff going through Vietnam that's a bit of a problem. Now, interestingly, the reverse process is also a problem because, as I'm sure you're aware, the US has said we will not allow certain things to be sold to China. And so there's quite a lot of products. I mean, apparently Singapore is a huge consumer of semiconductor chips. Well, last time I checked, there's not a lot of computers being made in Singapore. And in the same way, there's a certain amount of stuff that comes into Vietnam and possibly, I'm not going to say definitely, might find its way into China. So I think when you look at this stuff, you have to think about what is real and what isn't. And I think when we start later on to talk about tariffs and all that sort of stuff, it's like what I would describe as honest, genuine business. Maybe somebody buys the raw materials for a shoe in China, brings them into Vietnam, it gets cut, gets manufactured, sewn, and all that. Everyone would turn around and say, look, that's genuine business. In the same way, if you buy the raw materials, you send it to the UK and send it on to America. What we don't want is we take it out of a big plastic bag, put it in a small plastic bag and ship it on to America. And that is clearly just somebody rerouting stuff to get around import tariffs.
Right. Well, before we turn to sort of the tariff discussion, I'd really like to still build the foundation here so people just understand, because like I said, before sort of the working of supply chains, if you will, transshipment, with Trump's first trade war, a lot of people probably wouldn't even give a second thought to Vietnam. So before we do move on there, I would just like to touch on sort of the history of Vietnam on the global stage. Could you just provide our viewers with a little bit of background detail in terms of maybe geopolitical conflicts, or just where it has sort of its experience, if you will, on a global stage over the years?
Yeah, well, I think, Vietnam, and I didn't know this until I moved here. I'd been in Asia a long time. I'd traveled to Vietnam, but I certainly didn't know as much about the history. The American viewers will probably be familiar with MASH and a few other movies, but that's not really representative of modern Vietnam. Vietnam's in a unique space because it had English soldiers in here at the end of the Second World War. The French obviously invaded and ran the place for a long time. The Americans got involved in fighting in Vietnam, and the Chinese invaded after the Americans did. So it's been attacked by 4 out of the 5 members of the UN Security Council, which I think is an all-time record. And you can understand why they're probably a little bit iffy about UN declarations and things like that. But going
So
back,
before you go on, sorry, I just want to step in here because, I certainly did not know that China had sort of invaded as well after the U.S. Because a lot of the headlines that I've been seeing of late is sort of this belief that Trump's trade war is going to push Vietnam into China's arms. But I think that's really great context that a lot of people don't know the history there. So could you just elaborate on that a little bit further?
yeah, I think the bit that, and again, we're going back to the late 70s, so people's armies and everything else have moved on a little bit, particularly the Chinese. But one thing the Americans did train the northern Vietnam up to be was extremely good jungle fighters. And I think the Chinese kind of thought Vietnam was a bit worn out. Vietnam had to go in over the border to Cambodia and Laos because there was some rather atrocious things going on there. And I think for whatever reason, China just thought Vietnam was looking a bit weak at that stage, and they invaded and came in from the north. It would be fair to say that Vietnam gave China a pretty good hiding, and they left reasonably quickly thereafter. And obviously, when your next door neighbors speak to the Mexicans about the Americans, vice versa, there's a history of people not being quite sure who should be ruling which part of which country. And therefore, sometimes relations are good. Temporarily, think the UK and France, and sometimes they're bad. Most of English history think UK and France. And so the Vietnamese are very wary of the Chinese. They want to have good relationships with them because they're the big next door neighbor. But they're not always inviting them round for tea. And so when we look at Vietnam's place in the world, it runs what it calls a bamboo policy. Bamboo is very flexible, tends to bend with the wind, but it stays there a long time. And they have done a very, very successful version of this, whereby they have what I would describe as the two big brothers. So they've got China on one hand, America on the other, and then they've got the two uncles. So they were very friendly with the Soviet Union. So they've got Russia there, and they've got Ukraine there as well. And they really work hard to keep everybody slightly at a distance, but on equal footing. It is one of the most interesting places I've ever been to, because you can get lots of Cuban cigars here because fellow communists, but Vietnam's friendly with the Cubans, friendly with the Russians, friendly with the Chinese. Every single nationality you can find here, because Vietnam has worked incredibly hard not to annoy people. Firm and fair, I think, would be their approach. Look, we maintain our sovereignty. We want you to respect our sovereignty. And that means it's running a narrow line, but I think anybody thinking that Vietnam is rushing to be subservient to any other country is delusional.
No, that's really great because, yeah, like I said, I mean, especially after the initial sort of back and forth, I did see that President Xi did sort of race over to Vietnam, if you will, and there was a whole bunch of headlines about trade pledges, and so that certainly was the narrative, but that context does help, I think.
Just to jump in there as well, when you're talking about that, quite interesting. Trump sitting there saying, "President Xi, please call me, please call me." To Lam isn't sitting there going, "President Xi, please call me." President Xi's coming down of his own accord. Now, you've got to put this in context where China is now kind of ringing around the region going, please be friends, having spent the last 10 to 15 years doing its best to annoy everybody as fast as possible. It's kind of hard when you turn around and go, oh, well, your backyard, aka the South China Sea, it's actually the South China, i.e. we own it, sea. And most of those countries have been sitting there going, well, no, not really. And Vietnam is at the forefront of that. There are several islands that would be considered to be a lot closer to Vietnam than they are to China, but that China thinks is theirs. There are oil fields and gas fields that haven't been developed because they, again, are very close to Vietnam, but China's saying, oh, well, those must be ours. So don't rush into the delusion that somehow China's best buds with the Vietnamese.
Yeah, so that certainly helps, as I said, in terms of framing where Vietnam is positioned within global trade. And there's certainly a lot of different, as you said, it's almost, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems almost like the Switzerland of Asia. But now I'd like to turn a little bit more to its domestic economy. I think the first thing that sort of pops into my mind is you did mention communist. So certainly on the spectrum of things, and one of the perspectives I believe you guys have shared with me there at Muddy Waters Asia is that it is receptive to investment. And so could you just, provide more detail on this domestic economy and how sort of, I know there's often a little bit of hand wringing, we've seen what sort of unfolded with China in terms of a communist rule and investment and whether or not that can be relied upon. Now, it's not to say that a democracy like the U.S. can necessarily be relied on either, given what we've seen unfold recently. But I think it would just be helpful now to pivot a little bit more to its domestic economy.
Yeah, I think one of the things, look, I'm, by most of probably our audience standards, quite old. And, when I was sort of in my 20s and younger, communism meant two things. It meant political communism and socio-economic communism. It is quite clear, I think, to just about everybody apart from the Cubans that socio-economic communism is a bust. And pretty much all what we would have described as the communist countries when I was young have given up the socio-communist economic model. And one of the great things to me as I look at the world today is that once China got rich, or relatively rich, everyone said it's okay to be communist. You can still be rich. You don't have to live in poverty and have a hair shirt. And that's been a great beneficiary to quite a large slug of the world's populations. I mean, we briefly mentioned India. Let's not forget, India had embraced the socio-economic communism model too. And they finally turned around later to the game and gone, doesn't work. You just end up with lots of people who are poor. Now, so they've given up that bit. And Doi Moi was when they turned around and went, you know what, it doesn't work. We got to get the foreigners come in. However, the political aspect of communism, one party in power, controlling stuff, has, depending on which country you look at, in some cases been really quite successful. It's interesting when I look at where the situation in Vietnam, where you come and you travel around in, we've been all over the country, taking Carson around and other people, people are financially poor, but they aren't what I would describe as lifestyle poor as they are in some of the world's democracies. Most people have homes, houses, somewhere they can live in. There is basic rudimentary healthcare. There is education. It's very different to some of the world's possible democracies. I'm not, anyway. So if you are a poor country, communism as a political system, there is a sort of scooping up of the bottom end. But anyway, coming back to focus on your question, look, to my mind, as I sit here in Vietnam, political communism is here to stay. Okay. And that has some advantages because it means if you have a party going in the right way, they don't spend all their time squabbling about elections every other year.
Right.
What they're doing is they're saying, look, we want to have roads, we want to build the country. It's about education, it's about development. And that is, I would suggest, the way Vietnam is going now.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's certainly interesting because I know a lot of the conversation around this trade war, certainly between the U.S. and China, has been sort of this argument that China might, even though their economy may be impacted to a greater degree by the tariffs, whether or not that actually bears out, is just sort of the political will, without having to worry about an election cycle. Obviously, here in the U.S. we have 4-year presidential terms, but there's also the midterm elections that are coming up that that our politicians all are wrangling around. So, no, that is really interesting. But in terms of the domestic economy, what has sort of transpired over the years, whether it has to do with foreign direct investment, as you said, sort of the infrastructure drive. How has that transformed Vietnam's economy, as we've sort of seen a lot of this FDI coming in from other areas of the world?
Again, going back for a bit of history, what's interesting when you think about Vietnam is that it came to communism quite late. So if we really think about it, came to communism 1975. Whereas you look at China, you look at Russia, it was a generation or 2 generations more. So even when I arrived here in 2021, there were people who saw it go from capitalism to communism. And now and I'm talking about the economic model, I'm not talking about anything else, which is why the South, for example, still had people who were quite mercantile and very interested in business and entrepreneurial. And, that's really possibly best been illustrated by some of those people who left in 1975 and gone to the US, amongst other pieces. And we were in Houston not that long ago, meeting some of the Vietnamese diaspora, and they have done extremely well. Hundreds of millions of dollars they made. And so what we might describe as the genetics of that is still in Vietnam. So when we start to think about the Vietnamese economy, and you can split it into North and South, Hanoi is the political capital. When you think about political capital, then usually you get heavy industry because it requires a lot of capital to go into those businesses. So the north of Vietnam, think big steel, heavy industry and all that sort of thing. Now, part of that is also climate. Down in the south, you've got a lighter industry, farming, growing, trading situation. There's a lot of seafood farmed and caught down here. So there's a bit of a difference there because of that geographic difference. But again, because Vietnam is very much a long, thin country with a lot of coastline, it's been a very trading country for a long time. And it was only under the sort of communist economic model that changed. Now that that's been let go, but now that has changed and people have moved to trying to create wealth, we see a situation where they didn't have the capital to rebuild the country. So they opened up to foreign investment, and they were reasonably close for historic reasons with the Japanese and the Koreans, who came in and said, look, we've got aging expensive. The Japanese had gone to Thailand for cars, and so Vietnam's sort of on the way, and they started building factories, and that started upskilling and taking the country forward.
I guess the one question I do have is, in terms of its overall economy, obviously we know that it's still heavily reliant on trade. You talked about at the opening where sort of the imports from the U.S. have remained relatively flat, but we've seen a massive run up in so to speak exports from Vietnam. Obviously there's transshipment in there as well, but I guess, do you have any sort of breakdown in terms of, because I think a lot of the view on Vietnam from the Western world or U.S. based investors that really haven't dug into this situation is if sort of these tariff rates stay, right, and it's put in this no-win situation of this trade war, does Vietnam's economy completely just collapse? Or is there enough momentum behind sort of its domestic economy, like you said, with an infrastructure drive or building out more domestic manufacturing, consumption? What is your perspective on that?
So the good news about the answer to that was the bad news. If Trump sits there and says it's 46% and there is no negotiation, then that is a real problem because FDI will stop and exports will, if not collapse, they will drop a remarkable amount. That's the bad news. The good news is the rate was so arguably ridiculously high and so stupid, and the government's like, oh my God, the economy is going to collapse, so we need to do something about this. And if you take, shall we say, Trump's traditional approach to any negotiation, it's, something completely ridiculous, so let's have a chat and we'll end up somewhere in the middle. So the assumption we're making, and I think just about every other Vietnamese person is making, including the government, is there is a middle range. Now, it's not naught, but it's equally not 46%. And I think that this is a great opportunity for Vietnam because you sit there and say, look, Ho Chi Minh, who's some would see as the father of modern Vietnam, set the country off on the road to independence. He came out of the Second World War and said, look, we would like to have our own country. There was a war fought, the Civil War, which the Americans were on the southern side, came out, fought, that went on a long time. But at the end of Ho Chi Minh's life, what he'd actually achieved was unity as a nation, but not real independence. When I mean independence, I mean not just you in control of the country, but can you stand on your own 2 feet?
Right.
Why do I say it wasn't fully independent? Because it was very dependent on support from Russia and later on some support from China. This new opportunity is Vietnam is going to be forced to turn around and get rid of transshipment. It is going to be encouraged to expand value-added business. So less of this, we buy it in for 98, send it out for 100. Mm-hmm. And more of it, we buy stuff in for 50, we play around with it, we do all sorts of stuff, we sell it on for 100. That is all going to upskill and benefit the country, at which point they will achieve economic independence, which is really the sort of end of Ho Chi Minh's legacy. And that if To Lam does achieve that, he will stand out as one of the greatest leaders Vietnam has had. So he's got two paths. Let the 46% stay and the country collapses, or find a way to, as I say, bookend Ho Chi Minh's legacy. And I'm fairly comfortable, and based on what he said, he's going to go for the latter.
That is actually a tremendous perspective because, I think there's a lot to obviously remains to be seen about how this will ultimately play out. As you said, the negotiations, and, that's part of some of the questions that I've had is, Vietnam has already offered to slash its import tariffs from the U.S. to zero. The Trump administration has said that's simply not enough. Obviously, we know the transshipping is part of that negotiation, that they're looking to get some changes done there. But a lot of the narrative has been, and again, this goes back to sort of those headlines I talked about in terms of you have the polling from the U.S., but then you have President Xi going over and making visits, and so it almost feels like it's stuck in sort of this unwinnable position, and that seems to be a lot of the narrative from the mainstream media here in the U.S. But it sounds like your view is entirely different.
I think entirely. I think there's a great opportunity, and let's face it. Let's not forget transshipment can go both ways. So there is nothing to stop. Let's say, the Chinese have come out and said we're not going to buy an American beef anymore. We're going to buy it all from Australia. Well, I haven't done the numbers, but I suspect that they'll suck up all the beef from Australia. Now, of course, one little way around that would be for Vietnam to start buying an awful lot of beef, chop it all up and send it over the border. So transshipment the other way, and the powers that be can then sit there and close one eye and do the Nelson, look out of the blind eye and go, oh, I don't see any transshipment. No, but it doesn't really matter because then the trade balances changes. But on a sort of serious trade balance, and actually coming back to your earlier question, look, I think the steps are you get rid of transshipment, you then turn around, and one of the great advantages of a communist political situation is everything needs a license. So you literally turn around to your exporters and say, well, what's the margin you're making on the business you're doing? If it's a low margin business, you're not paying as much tax. No, sorry, no export license. And you basically get rid of all your low margin exports. So you do that. You then reroute. They're currently importing a bunch of stuff like oil and gas and person. And one of the biggest suppliers for that is Qatar. So you turn around to the Qataris, and okay, it's not so great for them, but you say, well, we're just going to buy everything from America now. There's coal coming from Australia, and yeah, okay, it's a bit more expensive to buy it. Instead of buying from Australia, we'll buy it from America. But let's say we pay 10% more for those products, but if it saves us having a 46% export tariff, then net, it's a real win for the country. Then you turn around and say, okay, we're also going to do some buying off America, so we need to buy a few planes, we need to buy some boats, perhaps some power plants. That starts to become tricky because you sit there and go, well, first of all, we've got to be vaguely nice to the Chinese, but that's okay because you can buy high-speed trains and stuff like that off the Chinese. It's kind of good. We want some nuclear power plants. We'll buy those off the Russians because A, they're kind of good at it, and B, we want to keep them reasonably on side. And then we go to the Americans for a few other things. As I say, we get back to a bamboo policy. Let's keep everybody friendly and in balance. Then, and I think this is something that there's been commentary on it, but people got to think that it shouldn't just be trade balance, it should be trade and services. Because a lot of stuff that we buy off a sophisticated economy like America, which is services. Now, if you buy $100 worth of sneaker off me and I buy $100 worth of Spotify off you, well, it kind of nets out. So let's be sensible and balance this out. But finally, and why services, I think, be really important to get that in the deal is if I was Tolam, I'd be sitting there going, look, what we need to do is jack up the productivity in Vietnam. We don't want to be competing with China for low-end mass-scale products. We want to be, because we've got 100 million people, so we're a decent-sized country. We're a lot better than most of the rest of the people in Asia, apart from Indonesia and India. So we're a decent-sized economy, so we can do things at scale, but not super scale. Don't try and take on India. Don't try and take on China. But we want to be productive. Forget this middle income gap. We want to just soar through that. The only way we do that is by producing super high value add. How do we do that? We go and buy educational services off the US. We jack up our universities to make sure our guys get up there on engineering, on robotics, on computers, and a few other things like that, where you're sitting there going, look, we can afford to spend on that stuff and we will reap the rewards. Because when it comes to product, you got to remember, Vietnam doesn't have the foreign exchange reserves to start going out and spending $10-20 billion a year on American product. Even if it couldn't, it can't afford to.
Before I let you go here, and this has been such a great, initial conversation, and I really look forward to all the other discussions we're set to have as we sort of monitor the situation, as we said, on the ground. But as a little bit of a tease for our viewers, what sort of things will you be watching, whether it's, sort of government, investment, or what to sort of expect from the stock market in Vietnam? Just what are sort of some of the things that you'll be monitoring? And obviously, we'll be reporting on those as they unfold. But just to give our viewers a sense of sort of the incremental steps. Obviously, the trade war negotiations are sort of speak for themselves, but sort of those incremental steps, like what sort of things will you be monitoring?
I think there's a couple of things, as you say, the trade war, whatever the tariff comes out with, and what I'd really like to see. I mean, yes, we'd love a low tariff, but actually, even if we have a halfway tariff, in other words, it's kind of there and thereabouts. What I'd like to see is an agreement where they turn around and say, look, the tariff today is this. It's contingent on you doing certain things. We're going to review it again in 6 months' time. And hopefully it then comes down because you're doing everything we've asked and we've agreed that's the way we want. That's the kind of relationship we want to have as two countries. That would be fantastic. The other thing, Tolam, our new general secretary, he's been in place since the autumn of last year now. Even before any of this started, he came out and said, look, we need to make our government efficient. We need to digitize the whole place. Now, they've got a really good IT company. FPT does a lot of IT outsourcing around the world. It's not that well known by the general public overseas, but it's an excellent first-class company, and I am absolutely sure they and some of their competitors could digitize the country. And I think you look at somewhere like Estonia, where they digitized the whole government. That would be transformational for Vietnam. Be great news. So his digitization push, he's already come out and said education is going to be free for Vietnamese people going forward. Now, that's useful, but what we really want to see is those education levels skilled up. Now, some are going to go, oh, well, typical Asians, but there's a big focus on STEM subjects here. They do their maths and all the rest of it. If you can push that and make sure the average level lifts all the way through the country, that would be great. But I'd like to see the real sort of push on science, a skill level as, say, robotics, modern pharmaceuticals, and all sort of things like that. That would be great.
And that's sort of in line with what you were saying, though, about sort of not the low margin mass sort of production, but more of that high level manufacturing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the great things Vietnam has, because of its size, is it's a much greater respecter of intellectual property than its big brother overseas. So you can come here and bring your pharmaceutical manufacturing, your computer manufacturing, and not actually suddenly find the factory next door is ripping you off. But I think if they follow the Korean and Japanese model where they encouraged people in and then said, right, great, you're doing this, now we want to see some technology transfer, they don't need to take it to the levels that the Chinese did, aka just rip you off. But they can do it from a level of, look, let's upskill the country because productivity is really what matters. And that's what increases living standards. And that's what I'd love to see. And over time, Vietnam has plenty of things it can invest in. We're far, far from the, let's build a bridge to nowhere because we need more GDP. Vietnam is still at the stage where build a bridge, people are going to use it. It's going to be full the next day. Our new metro, which is great news, it needs to be tripled, quadrupled, add more routes. So there's lots of projects that could be invested in to build the economy and keep it going. And if Tolam can keep that driving forward, it's going to transform the country.
Well, Rob, I think that is a great way to wrap this up because, as I said at the outset, I think the goal was really to establish, sort of a foundational understanding of not only Vietnam's economy, but also just where it sits within the global stage, how history, geopolitics have played into sort of its stance on that global stage. But also there's a lot of really exciting things to look forward to. And as you said, I think sort of having that non-consensus view where it's not necessarily stuck in this unwinnable situation where if we can see that incremental progress, that could lead to some tremendous opportunities. So I just want to thank you for coming on today. And as I told our viewers at the outset, this is something that we'll be running several discussions on, several episodes, and we'll be keeping track of sort of on the ground developments and really providing the sort of in-depth research that you're not going to see from your traditional mainstream media. So, Rob, thanks again. It was great speaking with you, and I really look forward to our next conversation.
Absolute pleasure, and I look forward to it too. See you soon, Mike.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Asia Podcast by Muddy Waters. If you like this episode or want to dig deeper into Muddy Waters' New World Order fun, head to muddywatersasia.com or follow us at Muddy Waters Asia for more. Don't forget to like and subscribe.